Shaquille O'Neal crashing Angel Reese's podcast turned out to be the kind of whirlwind fans couldn't stop talking about. Picture it: Shaq, the larger-than-life NBA legend, known for his towering presence and even bigger personality, stepping into Angel Reese's zone. Reese, a star in her own right, has dominated college basketball, drawing attention for her skills and strong voice, both on and off the court. She's one of the few players at her level willing to go toe-to-toe verbally, yet here she was, squaring off with the guy who practically wrote the book on sports trash talk. The anticipation was electric. But before we proceed further, don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe. As the conversation kicked off, it was clear that Shaq wasn't there to just sit back and cheerlead. He jumped right in, quick with the humor, quicker with the barbs, and didn't shy away from poking fun at Reese's game. What started as a friendly chat about their shared love for basketball turned into Shaq gently, then not so gently, picking apart her moves, her style, even her wardrobe choices, with that trademark smirk only Shaq could pull off. Reese was smiling too, but there was a moment or two where you could see she hadn't been expecting this level of roasting on her own show. This was her turf, after all. But if Shaq was aware of that, he didn't let it show. Throughout the podcast, Shaq would throw in these seemingly innocent comments that had Reese visibly raising an eyebrow. When he teased her about the infamous ring gesture she made after winning a championship game, calling it cute, Reese shot back quickly. But every time she defended herself, Shaq had a snappy reply waiting. He laughed it off, talking about how she'd need more than one hand to do what he did. Reese couldn't help but laugh, but there was that competitive spark in her eyes. The kind that's fueled by wanting to prove something, especially when the other person is a living legend. She pushed back, calling him out for being washed up, but Shaq just laughed harder. This wasn't just a podcast, it was becoming a full-blown competition, one neither of them planned on losing. But it wasn't all jabs and shade. Shaq managed to slide in a few nuggets of wisdom, the kind you'd expect from someone who's seen it all. Talking about perseverance, he reminded Reese that championships are won through consistency, not flashy moments. The irony wasn't lost on Reese, who's built her brand on big-game energy and a fierce persona. Shaq's advice landed with a blend of humor and gravitas, like a wise uncle who's willing to joke but won't let you forget the lesson. Reese seemed to be absorbing it, but she didn't let him have the satisfaction of fully agreeing. Instead, she fired back that Shaq only knew that because he'd been around so long. The playful jabs went back and forth, with Shaq occasionally laughing so hard he had to pause, while Reese grinned, clearly loving the challenge. This exchange wasn't just two athletes talking shop. It was a clash of generations, styles, and philosophies. Shaq came from a time when NBA players kept it straightforward: power over finesse, grit over glamour. Reese, on the other hand, embodies a newer era of athletes who blend their game with social media clout and aren't afraid to show personality on and off the court. Watching Shaq's face when she mentioned her social media following was priceless. He squinted, half serious, half amused, and asked her how many followers she thought she'd need to match his legacy. Reese rolled her eyes, countering with the fact that her generation isn't just about numbers but influence, impact, and the vibe they bring. Shaq smirked, leaning into the mic, and said, "You'll need more than vibes to fill a trophy case." There were moments when Shaq almost seemed like he was reliving his younger days to Reese, reminiscing on the pressures and expectations he faced at her age. But he wasn't about to let that get in the way of a good roast. He teased her about the way she celebrated her last game, calling her dance moves stiff and suggesting she take notes from his halftime performances. Reese nearly spit out her drink at that, reminding him that he'd been out of the game for longer than she's been playing it. Shaq laughed, clearly unbothered, and hinted that maybe she could use a little of his old-school swagger to round out her skills. As the conversation went on, the playful antagonism took a slightly more serious tone. Shaq, with his decades of experience, began to question Reese's approach to the game. He hinted that maybe she relied too much on her personality, her brand, and should focus more on the fundamentals. Reese immediately bristled, pointing out that she's put in just as much time, blood, and sweat as anyone else. Shaq, never one to back down, pressed on, pointing out that talent is fleeting but skill is forever. He wasn't being harsh, well, not entirely. Shaq wanted her to realize that the game would keep evolving, and that no amount of flash could replace skill and work ethic. Reese, clearly passionate about her own journey, retorted that her game was evolving, and that maybe Shaq's generation didn't appreciate just how hard her path was in the social media age. Their exchange highlighted a contrast that's rarely seen in sports discussions. Shaq represented the old guard, all about brick-and-mortar dedication, while Reese embodied the new, mixing traditional skills with a digital age mindset. At one point, Shaq feigned complete bewilderment when Reese mentioned brand sponsorships and TikTok deals. He played the old man card, jokingly lamenting how back in his day, you'd be lucky to get free shoes. Reese didn't let him off easy, teasing him right back about how he didn't have to handle trolls online or deal with critics dissecting his every move. Shaq shrugged, saying he'd handle them the same way he handled any defender, by bowling them over. It was a throwback to his rough-and-tumble style on the court, and Reese had to admit the mental image was hilarious. The real zinger, however, came near the end when Shaq started listing off some of Reese's moves and comparing them to his own repertoire. He mocked her for a particular spin move, calling it a little dance move with no bite. Reese's jaw dropped, and the entire podcast crew was losing it. She laughed, but it was clear Shaq had hit a nerve. She fired back, "Well, maybe you'd know about dancing moves, considering how much you tried rapping back in the day." Shaq, unflustered, gave a massive grin, admitting that his rap career might have been a bit ahead of its time, which sent everyone, including Reese, into fits of laughter. What made the interaction so gripping was the dynamic. Shaq, the legend with nothing to prove, and Reese, the rising star determined to carve out her own path, each trying to score points, each trying to one-up the other. For Shaq, it was clear that he saw in Reese a bit of himself, young, ambitious, unafraid to stir things up. But he wasn't going to let her think she could coast. He pushed her, challenged her, maybe even tried to humble her, though Reese wouldn't budge an inch. She gave as good as she got, meeting every one of his roasts with her own. And yet, by the end, the respect between them was obvious. Shaq, having put Reese through the verbal ringer, seemed to see her resilience as proof that she was on the right track. Reese, having survived what felt like a trial by Shaq, came out smiling, even laughing with a sense of triumph. It was as if she'd passed some unofficial test set by the big man himself. They closed the podcast with laughs and a friendly handshake, but it was more than just a friendly farewell. It was a moment where two competitors acknowledged each other as equals, in spirit if not in stature. Shaq's appearance on Reese's podcast might have seemed, at first glance, like an ordinary chat between two athletes, but it was anything but. It was a playful battle of wits, a generational clash, and ultimately, a reminder that even the legends need to respect the rising stars. For Shaq, it was a chance to pass down wisdom and show he still got it, even if that wisdom was wrapped in a heavy dose of sarcasm and shade. For Reese, it was an opportunity to prove that she could hold her own, not just on the court, but in the face of someone who's become iconic for his toughness and wit. Listeners were treated to a fascinating look at what happens when two worlds collide, when old-school grit meets modern flair and neither side is willing to back down. Shaq may have walked in ready to show Reese the ropes, but by the end, she'd shown him that the game has evolved in ways even he might not have expected. It was a roast, a bonding session, and a subtle passing of the torch, all wrapped up in laughter and friendly banter. In the end, both Shaq and Reese left the podcast with their reputations intact, if not slightly boosted. Shaq showed he could still dominate any room he walked into, and Reese proved that her strength wasn't just in her game, but in her confidence and personality. The world saw two basketball giants, one seasoned, one emerging, come together, clash, and walk away with mutual respect.